Hi there, and welcome to another episode of Therapy by the Book, the show where we take your favorite fictional characters and ask the question, what would it be like if they came to therapy? My name is William Haddad, and this week I want to welcome back Amy Cousineau to the show. Amy, great to have you again.
Hey, William, it is great to be back.
It is so wonderful to have you back on the show. For new listeners, Amy was my guest on the very first episode of Therapy by the Book. Her background is she's a clinical psychologist. She's worked over 20 years with children and trauma in the nonprofit and mental health space, and currently works as director of program development at Foothill Family Service and the head of their private practice department, Flourish. Wonderful clinician, wonderful colleague and mentor to me. Really excited. And this time, Amy, you picked out our character client for today.
I did. I chose the inimitable Nurse Ratched. And my tagline was, she's just doing her job. But I want to be clear that I mean that in the most sinister possible reading of that tagline.
I was piqued. You had my curiosity right away when you said this is who you wanted to talk about. I want to say I'd seen the movie of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in the past, but I'd never read the book. So I made a point to go back and read the novel as well as watch the movie again in preparation for today. And I have to say I was shocked by some of the stuff that, to say the least, that's going on in that book.
Right.
The movie I remember having some pretty extreme and dark moments, but the book is on another level.
The book is on another level. And for most of us who haven't read it since high school, it was also really enlightening in a very horrifying way to revisit this book. And I noticed even as I was poking around online, looking for some extra information and, thought that has already happened about this book. And I couldn't help but notice times when people had misremembered things that happened in the book. And I think that's kind of a natural protective human mechanism to kind of need to remember it a little bit differently so that we can remember what we liked about it.
I couldn't agree more. That's not surprising at all to hear. I think it has something to do with speaking more generally, the phenomenon of how we do have a natural tendency to remember the best, which is why often you get all these instances of people saying, it's not like in the good old days when everything was fine and dandy, only to discover when we actually dive in and revisit the good old days, they weren't so good in the first place.
They were only good for a very small and specific subsection of our society, weren't they?
So tell me, when we look at Nurse Ratched as a character, what are some of the first qualities that stand out to you about her?
Before we talk about Nurse Ratched, I'd actually like to talk a little bit about her creator, Ken Kesey, because obviously all fictional characters are the children of their creators, but in this particular book, that is really, really, really true. And so I think it helps us to understand Nurse Ratched if we understand a couple of things about Ken Kesey. So as probably many people know, Ken Kesey was part of the counterculture movement of the 1960s. This is the same Ken Kesey who assembled the Merry Pranksters and took their cross-country bus trip, doing lots of drugs and throwing lots of parties where they spiked fruit juice with LSD and sometimes told people that's what they were giving them and sometimes didn't. So this is really Ken Kesey was definitely one of the legends of the 60s countercultural movement. And of course, a really big part of that was rebelling against the establishment. That wasn't really his term so much. His term is the combine. That's what he uses throughout the book.
A very interesting terminology for that, I thought.
Totally.
When I hear combine, I always think of the farm term, like the combine harvester tractor. So that wasn't,
Yes.
it was interesting to hear it applied in this much more sinister context.
Right. Well, and I think Kesey maybe uses that word intentionally because part of his point is that the combine of the establishment, the centers of social power that tell us what is acceptable and not acceptable to fit into society, I think part of his point is that it does chew people up and spit them out a little bit. Um, so for Ken Kesey, this is like really, I think, the central conflict of the book. And in his mind, that was society's biggest problem. I realize that's kind of a provocative statement considering we're talking about the 60s when the civil rights movement was also happening. There are a lot of Pandora's boxes that I think we'll have to sort of put to the side, like acknowledge and then know that that's outside of the scope of today's conversation. But so acknowledged and maybe pinned for later if we have time.
We only have so many minutes in an episode, audience, so apologies. There will be a time and place for all boxes.
That's right.
We can only open one at a time on the show.
That's right. So really, I think one of the major themes of this book is the conflict between freedom and the rebellious spirit and being the freedom to be who you want to be, even if you march to the beat of a different drum, versus the combine, the machine that wants to enforce conformity and homogeneity. But there's another piece for Ken Kesey too that I think many people know, but maybe some don't, is that he himself actually did work as an overnight staff in a psychiatric inpatient ward. And that really influenced his views on psychiatry and, of course, was a really heavy influence on his writing of this book. So he was writing about many of the abuses that he saw, but also what he saw as the fundamental flaws of psychiatry as a whole. So Ken Kesey was part of the early anti-psychiatry movement. Exciting. He lived a full life. So one of the things that I think is important to acknowledge about the anti-psychiatry movement of the 1960s is that there were a lot of things that they were protesting that they were right to protest. And as we talk through this book, and ECT and lobotomies and patient confidentiality and humiliation, like we could see that a lot of these things really were being done back then. So it was right to protest that those things were happening.
Looking at, I'm glad you mentioned that because I agree. I think it's worth emphasizing especially as later on we dive more into Nurse Ratched, how very different the field of mental health was at this point in time. It's almost completely unrecognizable by the standards of psychotherapy treatment today. What would you say are some of the biggest, I can't believe that's how we used to do it, instances that we can see illustrated in the story?
I'll try to keep it to my top 3 and only 45 minutes. No, I'm kidding. I will try to summarize as quickly as I can. So one of the things that really jumped out at me is how we treat patient confidentiality. I know in comparison to shock treatments and lobotomies, that might seem kind of innocuous, but there is a moment early on in the book when McMurphy is first admitted to the ward and he attends his first group therapy session, and Nurse Ratched pulls out his file and reads from his patient file to the group. That is a massive violation of confidentiality. And then I think in the much more heartbreaking version towards the end of the book, when Billy Bibbit is found the morning after this party with a woman in his room and he's feeling great about himself, and Nurse Ratched responds by saying, "Oh no, I'm going to have to hate to tell your mother about this." And it completely destroys him. Okay, it's important to understand that Billy in the book is in his mid-30s. He's an adult. So none of that information, no information should be shared with his mother about this. But one of the things I found, I think most of us have heard the term HIPAA. That is the current federal law that protects our protected health information. And there are like really strict rules about what we can and can't say as mental health professionals. But that went into effect in the 90s. Before that, there was no federal law that had a uniform legal expectation for patient confidentiality before then. So back in the 60s, there was kind of a patchwork of state laws that were very inconsistent.
Do you know if it was state by state that these policies were legislated and enforced?
That's exactly right. It was state by state. And the American Medical Association had just overhauled their ethics statement in the late 50s. And so basically, the guiding principle was doctors needed to keep their patients' secrets and the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm. But that's really it. So while Nurse Ratched certainly violated the do no harm principle, for her to read out of his file in group therapy may not have actually violated any laws at that time. Threatening to tell Billy's mother probably would have, but today she would have been fined. The hospital would have been fined. She may have faced jail time, and the hospital's privacy officer may have faced jail time for those kinds of antics. So that really jumped out at me as the first thing.
On a related note, too, they never say this in the movie, but in the book, it is implied or even directly mentioned at one point that Nurse Ratched is close friends with Billy Bibbitt's mother, which is why she turns to his mother as a source to try to chastise him at the end there, which in itself is, by today's standards, yet another violation of a very unethical dual relationship.
Wildly inappropriate. Could never happen. Maybe in my top 3, the next one would be the use of electroconvulsive therapy. So this has a long and interesting history. The use of induced seizures to treat mental illness actually dates back to the 16th century when they used to use camphor to induce seizures.
Wow, I'm not sure I knew that, actually. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I learned all kinds of things preparing for this episode.
More you know.
So kind of nuts, right? So in the 1930s, this Hungarian psychiatrist observed that epileptic patients had more glial cells than patients with schizophrenia. So he thought, okay, maybe seizures have this protective effect in mental illness. So he was injecting patients with camphor to induce seizures. Anyways, we've come a long way, which is great. So then these Italian scientists come along later in the 1930s, and really they were trying to find a safer alternative to injecting chemicals in people to induce seizures. So they were the ones who developed electricity as the safer option. It started from a good place, right? Good intentions here. So they first applied ECT in 1938. At the first, ECT was done, though, without any anesthesia or muscle relaxants. So those first patients, they were being helped, but they were also experiencing a lot of pain and were also receiving a lot of secondary injuries from the thrashing from the electricity into the brain, because this induces a seizure. That's what it does. So fortunately, by the time we're getting into the 1960s is when they started introducing muscle relaxants and anesthesia so that the shock could be delivered, but trying to mitigate all of those other really negative secondary effects. Unfortunately, it is true, there is evidence that in the 1950s, ECT was used as a way to control difficult patients, or was misused, I should say, as punishment. ECT is brutally misused in the book as part of a power struggle when Nurse Ratched tells McMurphy that if he apologizes for the fight he had just gotten into or admits he's wrong, then maybe he won't need the ECT after all. And McMurphy is defiant, admits no such thing, and this escalates into like a 2-week period, I think, of almost daily ECT treatments to really kind of like, I guess, shock him into submission.
Something else that people who watched the movie I know have pointed out is that although McMurphy was committed to the ward and therefore would not have had any say in whether or not doctors wanted to give him ECT, the other patients who go up with him for some of the sessions, namely in the book, the narrator, the Chief Bromden, and one of the other patients, I'm blanking on his name, are in the movie, it's portrayed that they're receiving it against their will, but we also hear earlier on that they are all admitted patients on the ward, which you would think therefore would have given them at least a little bit of leeway with whether or not they wanted to accept that kind of treatment, even by the standards of the decade back then.
Yeah, the standards for consent is a really different thing back then. And unfortunately, many populations, especially the vulnerable and marginalized ones, like patients in a psychiatric ward, were often given treatments without ever even asking their consent. It was just kind of a, come on, we're going and doing this thing. And so even for patients who were admitted and ostensibly they could just walk out the front door anytime if they wanted, they were still put in this one down position in that power dynamic where this may never have even been presented as a choice for them. Also, there was this very patronizing attitude of the doctor knows better than you. And especially if you're quote unquote crazy, then you shouldn't be allowed to have consent over your treatment because we know what you need better than you. So
that whole phenomenon, I think, is also a great example of that, is how when some of the patients are receiving their medication, they ask what's in the pill or what is this for, and the nurses just basically dodge the question. They say, just take it, it's good for you, which was, I mean, it was mind-boggling, to
right?
me, that you would give a patient medication without explicitly stating why and what it was for. But there you go. There was just this attitude of, reinforced silent compliance that seemed to run as a very strong undercurrent in these ward environments that very quickly, I think, depleted any goodwill that might have been given on good faith from some of these patients.
Oh, 100%. And to our listeners today, you have the right to know any medications that you're being prescribed and what they are for. And we encourage you to ask those questions.
Please ask us those questions. We will happily tell you.
Yes. The interesting thing about ECT is this is actually still used today. In different circumstances, it is definitely considered much more of a treatment of last resort, but there is evidence that ECT can help very severe depression and bipolar disorder. And I think probably the most famous person is Carrie Fisher, the late great. She was actually fairly public about voluntarily going back for repeated ECT treatments because it helped her. So this is something that obviously should be used sparingly and never as a method of control or punishment, and only when all other treatments have failed. Because there is a side effect that is kind of a doozy, and that is memory loss. For most people, that's a short-term memory loss and just for the events around getting the treatment. But long-term memory loss does occur. So that is the reality of today. But yeah, kind of an interesting history of ECT, right?
Absolutely. It does seem to exist in this very gray area where mental health treatments are concerned. On the one hand, you have everything we just talked about, all of these terrible drawbacks, the undercurrents of coercion and manipulation going on in some of these places. On the other hand, it is hard to see, even by 1950 standards, something that was zero help at all being allowed to keep on being administered as long as it was. You would think there were at least some people that it did genuinely help, and it seems Carrie Fisher was one of those.
Right, and really one of about 100,000 per year who receive this treatment. So
there you go. It's something that I actually say in the informed consent for my private practice, which is that talk therapy may be a solution for you. It may not be the only solution for you.
Right. It's probably a lot less jolting than ECT. Okay, it's not appropriate. It's not appropriate to joke about ECT. You can cut that out if you want.
There goes like half our audience right there.
Okay. The third of my top 3 things that have changed most significantly, of course, would be the lobotomies. Lobotomies also have a long and interesting history. A lobotomy involves separating the frontal lobes from the rest of your brain. So this is obviously very invasive and is way too heavy of a hammer for whatever nail you're trying to hit. So the first lobotomies were done by drilling holes on each side of the head. And in the movie, you see those little scars on McMurphy's head when he is wheeled back. So that means he has had a prefrontal lobotomy, which is a surgical procedure where they separate the frontal lobes from the rest of the brain. This is another thing where some neurologists, Walter Freeman and James Watts, they had developed this. They called it the precision technique. But they started searching again for maybe a safer way to do a lobotomy. And so Dr. Freeman specifically started thinking about how can we access the brain maybe through the eye socket using an ice pick.
What could go wrong?
Indeed. And it's so much better because it's a 10-minute outpatient procedure. And he really saw his chance to put his name in the history books. So he went on this big publicity tour to brand transorbital lobotomies, that's what those are called, as the cure-all. So in the 1940s and in a little bit to the 1950s, really the public impression of lobotomies was that they were kind of this cure-all. It's quick and easy, just cause a quick little lesion to the brain in the right area and all of your problems are solved. Of course, there was a 14% deterioration or death rate, because again, ice pick to the brain.
Right. Small detail.
Yes.
So, some fine print, but don't worry about that.
Exactly. And again, the history of consent with lobotomies is spotty at best. The very first transorbital lobotomy was done on a woman who withdrew her consent. I changed my mind. I do not want this anymore. She got it anyway. And lobotomies were most often given to women, elderly, and mental patients in hospitals. The age of the lobotomy really started to drop off in the 1950s with the advent of Thorazine, the first of the psychopharmacological drugs. So now we had a way to help treat those really severe symptoms without causing brain damage to do it. So that was exciting. Dr. Freeman continued to do lobotomies. His last one was in 1967 because he had a really hard time letting go. And that last one ended in the patient's death. So it had this ignominious end. And it is so good that lobotomies are no more.
An interesting note on the film, I'm not sure they ever actually say the word lobotomy. I don't think they explicitly speak, aloud that that's what McMurphy has been taken away to the upper ward to have done to him at the end of the film. It's told entirely through visual storytelling when they finally bring him back down and the chief raises him up on his bed and we see the part of his scalp that's been shaved and the scars and stitches. And I'm assuming, based on what you're saying about how prominent this method was for decades in the public eye, that audiences at the time would have, for the most part, known without needing to hear it spoken, that is exactly what had been done to him, to McMurphy.
Right. Yes, I think the audience at the time would have recognized that. And I think what's interesting is in the book, our narrator takes the trouble to explain that the hospital has gotten better at this lobotomy procedure, and they do it in the quote unquote right way, which I think is referring to that transorbital lobotomy, ice pick through the eye socket. And he tells us, but that's not what McMurphy got. He got it the old bad way. And so it is actually recognizing in the book, kind of not only spelling out that he got a lobotomy, but that he got like the old version, the surgical lobotomy that was more dangerous.
The rough, edgy, old school version of the procedure. Yeah, that's brutal.
So we've come a long way, folks.
So what do you know about, in terms of both treatment frequency and, I guess it need not be said efficacy, but in terms of the frequency of how often lobotomies were performed versus ECT throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s? Was one more prevalent than the other? Did they sort of occupy the same kind of space when it came to mental health in general?
That's a really good question. I can only speculate. I don't know for sure, but I would assume that it probably followed the same treatment sequence as in the book, because ECT is something you can recover from and can be done repeatedly, and it is far less permanent for the most part in its effects, whereas you can only get one lobotomy. So I think probably far more ECT sessions were done than lobotomies were done, but I really don't know how they would compare in terms of numbers of patients receiving them.
I will say, just it seems even harder to stomach the idea that lobotomies lasted as long as they did than ECT, just given how far more invasive, and it seems completely ineffective at probably dealing with the actual problems that they were.
It's a story of hubris, and most people who receive lobotomies that didn't die from it, they were generally seen to be less agitated, but also side effects included apathy, passivity, lack of initiative, no ability to concentrate, blunted affect. Basically, it took away people's spark and personality, and it blunted a lot of who a person was, even when it was quote unquote successful.
Something else that I'd like to take a moment to explore, and then I think we'll dive into Nurse Ratched herself, is the definition of conditions like schizophrenia, depression, and psychotic or psychopathy from then compared to now. Because I think it's also true, certainly the DSM-5 did not exist back in the 1960s. And, the words are still the same today. We still talk about schizophrenia or patients who are psychopaths or psychopathic tendencies. But what we mean now, what most, I think, clinicians and psychologists mean when they use those words is very different from what those meant back in the day. And to be admitted as a schizophrenic or as a patient with schizophrenia in the 60s probably wouldn't hold up to scrutiny by the modern criteria of today's definition. What are your thoughts on that?
No, it probably wouldn't. I think who is a psychopath, I think that term was used much more generally and to refer as much more of an umbrella term.
Yeah. They mention in the film, and I think in the book too, that McMurphy has psychopathic tendencies or even is a psychopath. But But generally, my understanding is the definition of that is it's a condition where you are incapable of feeling empathy for another person. There's just a part of your brain that is closed off to that emotional connection and relatability that is so universally human, quote unquote. But that's certainly not McMurphy as in terms of his personality or behaviors. Far from it.
No, and in fact, kind of an interesting note on the term psychopath now. Psychopath and sociopath are legal terms these days. They are not diagnostic terms. So in the current DSM, the most closely related diagnosis would be antisocial personality disorder.
That's right.
And so, but no one knows that term. What's in the public lexicon is psychopath or sociopath. But yeah, I think back then psychopath was more closely used to just say this person is very disturbed, rather than really how we would see it now. The other interesting thing back then is psychiatrists in the 1960s tended to be much more steeped in psychoanalysis and that kind of training. So it's much different than today, where psychiatrists mostly make diagnoses and will consult with a therapist and then prescribe medication. Some of them do therapy, and that is great and wonderful because training has also improved for psychiatrists. But they would sometimes see diagnoses like schizophrenia through a psychoanalytic lens and try to interpret things like hallucinations and delusions as somehow stemming back to maybe a cold and frigid mother or something like that.
Whole ding dang darn Oedipus complex.
Oh yes.
Which I believe they mention in the book at one point too. It's made pretty clear that certainly at least the group that Nurse Ratched runs follows the Freudian approach and uses that modality, for better or worse.
Well, they use that and something called the therapeutic community, which is it's kind of a different thing. And that is actually a thing that exists today, I think, in a better form. So maybe let me talk about therapeutic communities briefly, because I do think, I think this is part of what Ken Kesey sees as what's wrong with psychiatry in general. So the therapeutic community is described by Dr. Psy.D as a democratic ward run completely by the patients and their votes, working toward making worthwhile citizens to turn back out onto the street. And our narrator, Chief Bromden, says it's how a guy has to learn to get along in a group before he'll be able to function in a normal society. So that is kind of what therapeutic communities are. It's community as mechanism for change. The idea is that each of us has this desire to fit in and cohere with our communities. And so if we can't, that's a thing that we want to overcome. And so in real life, this is mostly used for substance use treatment. But the idea is if you are not fitting in with your community, then that's going to force you to do some self-examination, to try some things differently so that you can change and grow, so that you can get back into your community as a functioning member. And so when we're talking about things like mental illness or substance use treatment, that I think has a lot of potential for good, especially when you insist on respect and dignity as part of that therapeutic milieu, right? Because it is true that we are social creatures, and it is true that, if you stare at someone just a little bit too long, that's weird and bad and pathological and highly noticeable. So there's some truth to the fact that we societally sort of determine what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, and what is crazy versus what is sane. But something like this, where the drive to conform to your community would have represented everything Ken Kesey hated, because he was all about resisting the pressures to conform. And so, I really thought about this a lot when talking about therapeutic communities in the book, because my first read on it was, oh, Nurse Ratched is really distorting and twisting this idea to humiliate the patients and turn them on each other. But then I thought, I'm not so sure about that. I wonder if Kesey is presenting therapeutic communities as he thinks they are. Not a twisted version, but just this is the inevitable outcome anytime you try to make people conform to societal pressures.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you that it's the latter, because he had, through the characters, I think, very much confirms that. There's this sense you get from Chief Bromden over the course of the whole novel, really, that it's just this uphill climb, this inevitable struggle, and he feels pity, really, for McMurphy, watching him fight against it, as he does, because he knows that it's all inevitable, that the Combine is gonna win out in the end, no matter how hard you struggle. And even Bromden and another patient, Harding, both admit at one point that Nurse Ratched herself is more a symptom of the problem of the system rather than the source itself.
Yes. So what a perfect segue to get into talking about Nurse Ratched.
Yes.
So
here we go.
The reason we did all of this setup is Nurse Ratched, I really think, is Ken Kesey's arch villain, representing or embodying everything that's wrong with the Combine, with the system. And to me, it was very noticeable that Nurse Ratched does not have any backstory. She has no character development. She gains no insight, because I think all of those things are characteristics of humans. And instead, in the book, she is consistently and routinely described as machine-like. Our narrator is always using, via his hallucinations that are really just metaphors throughout the book, that he can hear her wheels clicking and turning when it's quiet, and he can see the wires that extend from her in every direction, and that's how she observes people. And she doesn't even need to really speak to the orderlies to give them instructions, because it's like she communicates via radio waves. So her smile is often described as painted on. So every single descriptor of Nurse Ratched throughout this book is an inhuman machine. And I think this says a lot about why she does what she does. Even when it's ruthless and cold and reprehensible, she is the machine of the Combine, and her goal is to turn these idiosyncratic free spirits into good little cogs in the societal wheel. And for her, that is therapeutic success. Even if it costs them their soul, their dignity, their sense of manhood, their spark of life, none of those things matter. Her job is one thing and one thing only, and that is to get these misfits to be able to fit in society at large.
Right. No character development. There's no insight. She really is, as you say, written to be more of a machine in human clothing than anything else. Not another cog, but also still very much the one of the central mechanisms that keeps it running and oversees the operations of it all. And yet, I do think that, probably unintentionally, Kesey also couldn't help inserting some subtext into the story that does hint at a little bit of a deeper narrative for her. At least how I interpret it when I read it, because we do learn a couple very slight, very hidden in the fine print facts about her past, which I thought were really interesting. One is that we know she's been working as a nurse in psychiatrics over 20 years. So for her, this is a career position. And even though she's not a doctor, and back then the doctors typically held a lot more authority than nurses in wards like these. She operates the ward as its CEO in all but name. She calls the shots with who she hires. If she doesn't like a doctor, she gets them fired just as easily as she gets one of the janitors hired or fired. And the character of Harding that I mentioned earlier also drops, I thought, a really interesting tidbit when he mentions that the actual supervisor of this ward on the hospital campus is a really close friend of Ratched's, who they've known each other all the way back since World War II, when both of them served as army nurses. This, to me, it speaks of two interesting things. One, it says that Ratched herself, if we're going to try to humanize her in theory a little bit, is probably someone who has seen a ton of war trauma. Secondhand, maybe even firsthand, she's probably somebody who's been around nothing but brutality and really some really grim and gruesome scenes in her life. And the other of it is that, again, this is the 60s, one of the most severely sexist periods in our country's history, except for all the other ones. And
indeed.
and she's living in this decade, coming off of the heels of the 40s. So you have I think very much a character who is a product of her environment, in the sense that she's got a lot of her own trauma that she has witnessed and tried to work, and now she's in a way sort of able to finally re-exert, metaphorically, some of that lost control in a new environment where finally she's calling the shots more as one of the head staff. And you've got that tight-knit camaraderie between her and the actual ward supervisor, that they have a past which any war veteran can tell you is a very real phenomenon, the bonds that grow out of those types of environments. To top it off, I want to point to something that Louise Fletcher, who played Nurse Ratched in the film, said. She described her interpretation of the character as someone who did care about her patients and felt what she was doing was in their best interest, but was too misguided and drunk off her own power to ever be sympathetic to their needs.
Yes, I would say so. And I think you've totally looked into my treatment notes for Nurse Ratched. I could not agree with you more. And with your conceptualization, because she has a high need for control. And we know that not everyone, I'm not diagnosing anyone's auntie or cousin or anyone else, so speaking in generalities, but a lot of people who have such a high need for control, it is because they have had experiences of things being chaotically and traumatically out of control. They were powerless to do anything about it, and they were negatively impacted by that. And that is often what will produce someone who has this very high need for control, as Nurse Ratched does. And yes, I did note that. We kind of know two things about her outside of work. One is that she was an army nurse, and the other is that she's single. Those are the two things that we know about her. And the rest we kind of know about her within the context of the hospital.
Right. And she goes to church on the weekend. She gives food to her church every Sunday. So she's active in her own community.
Right. So, but I'd like to circle back a little bit to the misogyny theme, because there is another theme that I think the book is fairly explicit throughout about, that Nurse Ratched, one of her primary methods for control of the patients is humiliation through emasculation. And this theme of emasculation is throughout the book. After the very first group therapy that McMurphy attends, he is talking with the rest of the patients about how that went and why aren't you horrified? And he tells them Nurse Ratched is a ball cutter. That is who she is. And of course, he's absolutely right, because that's how Kesey wrote her. And that is that's what she does throughout the book, is emasculate the men over and over and over again. That happens to Billy Bibbit after he's found with Candy and, he's feeling great. This invoking of his overbearing mother who still infantilizes him. It's incredibly emasculating. A couple of weeks after they come back from their fishing trip is when, and this is like one of the more horrifying scenes in the book, is when Nurse Ratched decides that all the men who went need a special shower because she learned that there was that type of woman that went on the trip with them and maybe they got some kind of cooties. And of course, she waits 3 weeks. So obviously, this is not about cleansing. This is about control and punishment for her. But all the men who went are lined up naked in the shower and subjected to this like weird genitalia cleaning that involves sticking a tube with some kind of cleansing goop up their anuses. Like, it's really, like, talk about emasculating. Like, what is more emasculating than this sort of like coded sexual violence against the men? So, but here's kind of the other meta piece of this for me. Nurse Ratched, kind of one of the very first descriptions we get of her is her and her big boobs. Her boobs are big. They're incongruously big. And this is kind of noted several times throughout the book. And I think the point here is that large breasts are associated with nurturing and mothering and warmth and everything Nurse Ratched is not. And so we get this combination, right? Like, she's cold, she's maybe sort of a betrayal of what motherhood is supposed to be or what nurturing nurses are supposed to be.
This sort of parody almost of the feminine archetype in males' eyes anyway of that
Exactly. And then she spends the whole book emasculating men left and right, and it sets up this conflict so that when she gets her comeuppance, sexual violence makes sense as part of the justice she receives through the telling of this book by Ken Kesey. So throughout, like, some of the ways that McMurphy kind of tries to get her goat is asking her what her chest measurements are, or pinching her bottom while the doctor next to him tries to hide his smile, ha ha ha, because sexual harassment is hilarious. And
writing those suggestive messages on the bathroom cubicle walls and beneath the toilet seats.
That's right. What we would clearly today call sexual harassment. There's no two ways about it. But when they get to that final conflict where Billy has committed suicide, Nurse Ratched, like the uber villain, needs to meet their uber fate, right? She needs to have her punishment that fits her crime. The way the story has been written, the movie just shows McMurphy strangling her. But in the book, he first rips apart the front of her nurse's uniform, causing her breast to come out and be exposed, exposing her nipples. Like, it's this whole sexual assault. But what the book is trying to elicit is like, yeah, she got hers by being sexually assaulted. Because
it's a twisted misogynistic logic, but a logic nonetheless if you put it in the context of the story as a whole.
Right, exactly right. And so that's one of the reasons why I say, like, we can't really understand Nurse Ratched without turning that mirror back on the author, because he's the one who created this, right? And so it does say as much about him that this is the uber villain that he has created. So anyways, enough of that. Nurse Ratched, she needs therapy. There is no question about that. For sure, we would need to process her trauma at work from being strangled almost to death, sexually assaulted, and sexually harassed.
Absolutely. Now, would you open with that, though?
Yeah, with Nurse Ratched, I think, given her character, I would want to know why she's in therapy in the first place, because she's certainly portrayed as a character who maybe doesn't think they need therapy. But let's assume she found her way into therapy. I would want to know what brought her in. And knowing, kind of what you, I think, very accurately talked about earlier in terms of high need for control, history in the Army, it's highly likely that she has experienced war trauma through that. And that probably has impacted who she is. I think just in general, I'd want to find out what her trauma history is. What was being in the Army like for her? What is working in a highly patriarchal system like for her? What was her childhood like? Because in real life, these kinds of behaviors don't spring out of a vacuum, and they don't spring out of a loving and well-attached childhood.
That's the thing.
Right.
That's the thing. And this is one of the reasons I love doing this show, is because sometimes, not every time, but sometimes you will come across stories like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with characters who are written in a very one-dimensional sense, and sometimes with intent, sometimes without. But as you say, that's just not possible for that to be the case whenever we look at a character from a therapeutic lens, fictional or real. It's not possible to have that kind of tunnel vision. So we have no choice as therapists but to start to look under and between the cracks. And usually, as is the case with One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you will often find a couple of hidden human element details that the author may have just not realized they were including, or may not have realized was actually still part of that character's identity, even if it's not what they wanted the audience to focus on. But by taking these into the greater context, we now, in a sense, change the nature of the character, or rather, I should say, we expand the nature of the character. And that's what allows for us to start to ask questions like these ones you're saying, which is, what was her trauma history? What was her childhood like? Because these things do not spring out of a vacuum. There's always something that has happened that's helped shape and define them to get to the point where they're at by the time that we open on the story.
That's absolutely right. I think that is very eloquently said, William. And, if I were going to maybe fully pull her out of the world of the book, one of the things that I would delicately also maybe try to find out is maybe she doesn't want to have sex with men at all. Maybe she's a lesbian. She is described in the book as single, woman of a certain age, cold and sexless, but really like sexually unavailable to men. So really, that's kind of one of her great crimes. is she dares to, not want to have sex with McMurphy. And,
the nerve.
but maybe she doesn't want to have sex with men at all. And I think in the book that would probably be a misreading of the book to speculate that she's gay, because I think really Kesey's, well, that was a Freudian slip. Kesey's, I think, point with her is that she is cold and sexless. And it's even hinted in a couple of conversations that the thing that will fix her is having sex, or having sex forced on her, right? So that is Kesey's true authorial intention. But, you kind of sit back and look at it and go, no, maybe.
I mean, I think both can be true. There's room for ambiguity here, because you can read between the lines. You can say certainly from Kesey's perspective and from the perspectives of the male characters, that's how they would have viewed her through the social and gender lens of their time, no question. And also, I think it's certainly possible, maybe even probable, that may very well have been part of why she presented herself as a sexless human being, was because the type of person she would have actually wanted to be with was not only not in her vicinity, but was in fact highly frowned upon at that point in society as well.
Right, because this book was published in 1962, and I think that's important to point out that 1962 was not 1968 yet. 1962 was like before the sexual revolution really came into full swing. This was kind of at the very beginning. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say 1962 was closer to 1952 than it was to 1968.
Absolutely, 100%. So, I'm just throwing that out there that if I were going to take her out of the book, that also might be something I'd want to assess for and support her in whatever way that she needs supported. I think certainly now psychoeducation is something that refers to when we are educating our clients on some kind of principle in psychology, whether it's a diagnosis or a type of treatment. It usually doesn't refer to telling someone how to do their job, but if Nurse Ratched found her way into my office, I might find a way to weave in principles of therapy that don't involve humiliation and pitting people against each other. And that really, it's actually a good thing for patients to have a sense of independence and dignity. And that's going to be the path to true health, not just making sure that they are super controlled until they don't rock the boat anymore for anyone.
Agreed. I like that. I'm glad you mentioned that because I thought about that a lot as well, prepping for this episode. I wondered, if we're talking with Nurse Ratched in a therapeutic environment, she is still a professional in her field. And even if we know that her methods and her philosophies are not in her patient's best interest, she's still our patient. So we have a duty to her to still act primarily within her best interest as her therapist. So it is going to be, I think, as you say, finding something of a balance between psychoeducation and psychoadvocacy.
Yes, psychoadvocacy, because it would be hard to sit and listen to her talking about her therapeutic techniques.
Not going to lie, that would put my ability to resist countertransference to the test. That's right. Absolutely. I would probably be seeking consultation myself and treating someone like that. And we would hope that by getting to the root of her issues, that would lessen her need to treat those men in such degrading ways. Do you think that working with her in part by just asking her to talk more about her own personal beliefs rather than her professional ones, like asking, do you believe in what you're doing on an individual level, not just for the sake of the hospital, or why is this work important to you? And certainly what made you choose to become a nurse?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I think those are things that should be part of therapy, because what we choose to do for work and what we believe in, our worldview, those are part of what makes us us. And I think if a therapist is really going to understand the client as a whole person, it's important to understand them as a whole person. And that would certainly include, these are my values. This is how I think I'm contributing to society. This is why this is very important to me. And not only that, William, I'm sure you've had this experience too. Oftentimes when people are talking about, oh, this is why this thing is very important to me, and all the reasons I believe in this, it's usually rooted in earlier experiences of some kind. There's usually some kind of teaching, maybe from a parent, that has happened along the way. And usually as they talk about it, the openings that we need present themselves, right?
I love that. Absolutely. It's sort of like the core memories concept from Inside Out. Only these are lessons as opposed to memories, but they do serve, as you say, as these sort of very pivotal milestones in forming our identity, which then gets translated into decisions, or what influences our decisions and behaviors. But it's only when we stop to really think about them in depth that sometimes we realize, hey, actually, maybe this isn't the best thing for me after all.
Right. Or maybe this isn't working for me, despite my persistence in doing this. Maybe it never has the outcome that I'm looking for. Or maybe it's giving me the outcome, but that outcome is not as satisfying as I thought it was going to be. So all of that really opens up the opportunity for self-examination. And that's therapy, right?
Exactly. It is, in a nutshell. Amy, I don't think I asked you this last time, but the question I always try to ask my guests to close out is, what is your favorite thing about being a therapist?
I really do like the process of getting to know someone deeply as a whole person and being able to help them make those connections, fill in those gaps, find the answers for themselves that they were looking for, that has brought them into therapy in the first place. And it is really exciting to serve, not as like the analyst or the person who spits out the answers for you, like, haha, this is the thing. Now go do this thing and you will be fixed. But really this process of being alongside someone and facilitating their own journey of understanding themselves better and finding those answers that really do, it changes things for them. And really it's a much more lasting change because they were going along their own journey, as opposed to me like writing out the analysis of what is wrong with them for them to take home and study and memorize. And I don't know. But so that for me is like really the therapeutic process at its most beautiful.
Amy, thank you so much for joining me on the show. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
Oh, my pleasure, William, my pleasure. And if we ever need a round 2 for McMurphy and other Pandora's boxes, you just let me know.
I think it's a given. Thank you everybody too for listening. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you all next time on Therapy by the Book.